We're continuing our sermon series on the book of Romans. And we're in Romans chapter 8 today. And what we've seen in the past as we've gone through Romans chapter 7 is there's this idea of moving from a slave to the law, a slave to what has held us down, and becoming like a slave of the good stuff, a slave of the kingdom of God, like a slave of God, right? And I think part of that makes sense, that there's a certain level of freedom, even though Paul is using this word of slavery, there's this it's a much better place to be on the side of the Creator and with the Creator. And we've seen that being a slave to the law, that even though we're trying to justify ourselves and make ourselves work out, that it just doesn't happen that way. And this week, we're evolving that idea forward. Because I don't think Paul ever wanted us to see our full identity as slaves to God. I think he was using that to move us from an idea that we are held captive by our thoughts and desires and the law around us, to seeing that we are part of the kingdom of God. But now he's moving that term from slave to son, or sons and daughters, And that's really fascinating. And one of the ways we see that is with the story of the prodigal son. Rembrandt painted the prodigal son twice in his lifetime. Well, at least that we know of. But it was 32 years apart. And that 32 years apart is kind of what I want to talk about today. About how we move from that slave to son identity. So here's the first one. Here's the first sketching of the prodigal son. Now, if you don't know what the prodigal son story is, I'll kind of catch you up here real fast here. I'm in the office in front of the bookcase. It's story time type of thing. The prodigal son is a story about that Jesus tells that there's this son who asks his father, who was very rich, had all this land and wealth, asked his father for his inheritance early before he died. And the father willingly gave it to him, gave him all of his inheritance. And the son went off into distant lands and squandered the money. Spent it on wild living and women, you could say, right? And he squandered all that and lost it all. And what's interesting is that this story is usually called the lost son. And that is true, he's lost, but it's almost like the son kind of lost himself as well, because as you kind of get a sense of the story as you're listening or reading through it, you see that everyone abandons him after he lost all of his money. Everyone abandons him, and he ends up friendless, and he doesn't have anything. In fact, things get so bad for them that he's probably on just this side of slavery, and probably basically a slave, and he's having to feed the pigs. Now, if you're a good Jewish boy, feeding the pigs isn't a good thing, right? That's about as low as it gets. But for him, it even gets lower, is because he's obviously not being fed enough. And it says that he even wants to eat the food that the pigs are eating. Not even so much as having some nice bacon from the pigs, but wanting to eat the food that we're giving to the pigs. It's even worse. And then a thought enters into the son's head. He's like, even my father's slaves aren't treated as badly as this. And it's almost like that same idea that Paul was playing with last chapter, in chapter 7 in Romans, that there's this idea of that we're moving from the slave of ourselves, the slave of the law, the slaves of all those things that hinder us, and we're moving them to now, oh man, if I could just be a slave of my father's house. Yeah, it's not where I used to be, but I don't deserve to be there. It's so much better there. And so the son practices this speech over and over to his father. It's like, I'm not worthy to be your son, Father. Just let me be a slave. Just make sure I can exist, right? I don't deserve to be around here anymore. And that's what Rembrandt sketches. That interaction with the father and the son. And this sketching is filled with action here, right? There's a lot of movement in it. And when you look at it, like, what does it tell you? As you look at the picture of the son there, what comes to your mind? What does he look like? The son doesn't look very well, does he? Doesn't look like things have gone well. He almost looks like beaten up. Like he looks gnarled up and hurt. He looks like grotesque almost. You know, and in the stories, like, I have this speech prepared. I'm not worthy to be your son. Let me work like a slave. And he ends up getting ready for the speech. And I think this etching really shows the heartbreak of the son trying to come back in to be around his father and his father's things. And it almost shows this grotesqueness with how the son, it's almost like Rembrandt is showing you, like, in a physical form, what that son would look like. And it's quite a striking image. I think this is how we often approach, like, God's greater story in our lives. That we love to live in some manner of order. Like, remember we talked about do this and you will live? Like, I think we love that understanding of, like, yeah, that's what I need to do. I need to make that happen. That we need to get God's inheritance, right? And we see that we're given it, and it's like, I don't want to squander it. I don't want to get rid of it, in other words. And we realize that oftentimes we have squandered it we've hurt friends. We've realized that we were short-sighted in a few ways. I have a feeling many of us have realized that we were short-sighted in a few ways here in the last few weeks. We realized, and we're like, oh my goodness, what a mess. And then we start thinking about, so how can I be better in order to please God? How can I live a better, more fulfilling life in order to please Him? And then what happens is we just exchange one slavery for another. We begin to put the expectations like, I need to live this way. We begin to live as slaves to people's expectations for us. We try to live in a way that pleases God. We are slaves. What do we need to do to live better? So we're slaves to people's expectations. We try to live according to what all these people are telling us to do. We may not say that, but we sure do it all the time, Like, how do I need to live to stay on this person's good side? How it dictates so much of how we live. And whenever we bump against that, it really causes anguish in our lives. We do the things that we don't want to do, and it ends up making us feel sick, even though we know that we are still the sons and daughters of the Father. It still makes us sick. We're like that prodigal son. We're slaves to the expectations of the world. We're slaves to the expectations of our American culture. Right? It's what governs us. How it governs how we work, how we play. It governs how we raise our children, these expectations. It governs how we dress and how we look. And it even governs the people that we associate with. And it even governs the Bible verses that we like and like to be inspired by. We're enslaved to these expectations. And what I think is really interesting is how we're enslaved to how we respond to the things around us. It even governs us how we respond to the pandemic that's going on. Respond a certain way to all of the things that are going on around us right now. With the protests, the injustice that's going on. Rioting. there's expectations that govern how we act and how we respond to even those things. And I think many of us find out that we are eating the slop of the pigs. That we see all these different expectations, and maybe some of us, our eyes have been opened here recently that we're like, oh man, my prior expectations were, I was overlooking the injustice of a lot of things, and now you look around and you're like, oh, all these expectations are causing me to eat the slop of the pigs. And that's not what I wanted. I was obeying all these expectations and all these things in my life in order to be closer to the Father and to be a good boy or girl, right? I was hoping that I could work my way up back into the Father's blessing, or maybe just earning my way back into heaven when I die. We may not we may not agree that that's what we do, but oftentimes it's how we're living. Like, do this, you got to do this. And I think that's what this painting shows. I mean, look at that etching that Rembrandt is drawing there, and the hurt and the anguish in the eyes of that son that is down there. It's almost like grotesque the way the son looks like. And I look back at my own sin, and I resembled even that. But it also reminds me how I would look at other people and see the grotesqueness there too. And I think that this is something that Rembrandt felt early on in his life. Rembrandt was like that prodigal son, that he had a speech prepared. He was trying to be a good Christian, to be a good husband, to be a good father, living under the expectations of all that, living as a slave to all of that, to raise the kids in faith. And I think that colored how he looked at that original sketching, where he's like, listen, you didn't follow any of that. And look, you look wretched because of it. And I think he could resonate with how he felt about that son in the image there, trying to live out God's greater story by the struggle of his brow. But then something happened. 32 years passed. And in that 32 years, Rembrandt ate his more than fair share of pig slop. He lost his wife. He lost 3 out of his 4 children. He lost his reputation. And then at the time when he lost his last remaining son, he painted the prodigal son again. And we see stopping. Stillness, quiet. The old sketch was so full of action, and it was almost this degraded view of the son groveling before groveling before his father as an unworthy, I need to just be your slave, right? But this one's different. It's stopping, stillness, and quiet. There's no action in this one. There's only the stopping of love. There's only love left. And just the cry of Daddy, of Abba, Father. Henri Nouwen is a renowned church theologian and thinker, and he was talking about this, and it's written about him for this, and it says, for Nouwen, the son looked like a prisoner, like a victim of a concentration camp, with his head shaven. The woman, however, that he was talking to offered a different view. She looked closely at the painting and told him what she saw. It was not the head of a prisoner, but it was the head of a newborn child. And with that comment, she captured the mystery of this moment. The one Who has been a slave to his passions is made by the very love of the Father into a son. And I think that's kind of like you and I. And I think Paul has some words for us there. So we'll grab the Bible. We have Romans chapter 8, beginning with the 15th verse. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. I love that. You didn't receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. But you have received the spirit of the adoption of sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. You've received that spirit which causes cries to go out to you like Daddy. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we also may be glorified with him. Notice what's being said here. Just like this prodigal son story, the father does not look at you and say, you must do this and you live. He doesn't say that. He looks at you, and by putting like a ring on your finger and making you a son, he basically says, he looks at you and goes, well done, good and faithful servant. Even if you haven't been a good and faithful servant. Jesus has rescued you and given you his spirit. And that spirit cries out, Daddy, cries out, Abba, Father. And the Father always goes to you. What a joy to have a Father that comes back to us and reinstates us, where we are almost like those newborns, where we're almost like new children rising up in the kingdom of God. He is the Father of his children. He is our Father. You are his joy. You are his delight. And he has rescued you. And we can take solace in that fact. This sermon, it really caused me to take aback and to think about my own life and how I used to look at other people, and it's how I see a lot of folks looking at others. With so much division and strife going on around us, it's so tempting to go, those are the baddies over there. They're different than me. They're terrible. And they're just They're just lower. They're just awful because they believe this, that, or whatever. And we draw that sketch that Rembrandt drew 32 years before the second one. But I think when you get some rough miles, you begin to see that it's not about so much what you're thinking or what you're doing, but what God thinks and what God did. And how he went to the very ugliest place, that is the cross, and brought us out of the muck and the mire and the pig's food to raise us up and become sons. And it's beautiful to think that our salvation doesn't come in exchanging one slavery for another, where we're slaves to God now and we have to do all that stuff. But instead, he has made us sons and ambassadors of his kingdom, the kingdom of love and grace. And as I look around today, I think that's the good news that we need to hear. That all of us, that we're okay because Christ did the work to make us okay. And I think that's good news.